それでは時間になりましたので始めさせていただきます。皆さんおはようございます。ただいまから地球圏未来設計イニシアティブ国際シンポジウム2016多様な自然文化複合を踏まえた未来可能な社会への転換、地球環境学における新たな挑戦を開催いたします。私は地球圏助教大西優子でございます。隣におりますのが同じく地球圏准教授スティーブン・マックリービーでございます。本日は2人で司会を務めさせていただきます。皆様どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。ありがとうございます。まずはじめに、皆様のお手元に通訳の機器がございますので、その説明をさせていただきます。本日、同時通訳が入っております。皆さんの機械に1、2というチャンネルがございますので、1が日本語、2が英語になっております。どうぞお好きな方に合わせてお聞きになってください。また、こちらの機器に関しましては、皆様がお帰りになる際、必ず受付の方にご返却いただきますよう、よろしくお願いいたします。それでは、開会にあたりまして、主催者を代表しまして、総合地球環境学研究所、安成鉄道所長に、開会のご挨拶をお願いいたします。
皆様おはようございます。ただいまご紹介に預かりました、地球圏、地球圏とも簡単に申しますが、正式名がですね、実は大変長くて、大学共同利用機関法人、人間文化研究機構、この総合地球環境学研究所と、非常に長い研究所名でございます。我々も地球圏と呼んでおりますので、ぜひこちらでも皆さん、地球圏といえばこの京都の総合地球環境学研究所であるという具合に思っていただければ幸いです。もう私たちの研究所の前にバス停がありますけど、そこも地球圏前という具合になっております。さて、本日はですね、この土曜日にもかかわらず、たくさんの方々にお集まりいただき、本当にありがとうございます。から今日はですね、我々いつも大変お世話になっております文部科学省の学術機関課の牛尾課長さんをはじめとして他の方々にも来ていただいております。本当にありがとうございます。今回のですねシンポジウム、これまた非常に長いタイトルですが、これは大体地球圏の何をやっているか、何を目指しているか、すべてのキーワード的に書かれておりますが、簡単に地球圏で初めてこの地球圏のシンポジウムに参加された方も多いと思いますので、簡単に地球圏のことをご紹介したいと思います。で、地球圏はですね、2001年の4月に大学共同利用機関として設立されました。で、ご存知のように2004年にですね、国立大学も法人化されましたが、そのタイミングで地球圏もですね、大学共同利用機関法人の一つである人間文化研究機構という機構の一機関となりました。この機構にはですね、6つの研究機関が入っております。で、関東で言いますと、多分ご存知の方多いと思いますが、一つは国立国語研究所、それからやはり立川にありますが国文学研究資料館、それから千葉県の佐倉にあります国立歴史民族博物館、この3つでございます。で、関西は地球圏、それからやはり京都に国際日本文化センター、研究センター、それから大阪千里にあります国立民族学博物館、民博といったところですね。この6機関です。で、さてですね、この地球圏はですね、一つにはですね、この人間文化研究機構にあるというところが一つミソでして、地球環境問題、いろんなを進めている研究所、研究機関、日本にももう結構たくさんあります。 ただこの地球研はですね、特に地球環境の問題というのは、もちろんこれは地球の自然がどんどん問題悪くなっているとかですね、変化している、これ環境が悪くなっている、これ何とかしないといけないという、そういうところで、2001年できたのもそもそも1998年7年だったんですか、COP3 という京都での議定書の会議がありました。それをきっかけにして作られたということですが、しかしですね、環境の問題というのはやっぱり人間自身の在り方が密接に関係している。すなわち地球環境問題というのは広い意味で人間の文化というところにその問題があるんじゃないかと、その辺からですね、始めよう。ですけど今日もですね、そういう視点で、まさにありますように多様な自然とそれから文化、これは複合的に密接につながった形で我々の地球の自然も文化、人間の文化も作られているし、人間の社会も作られていると。でそういうその自然と人間がいわば複雑に絡み合って作っているその地球社会をどうしていかないといけないかと、そういう視点での研究、地球環境研究を我々は進めております。でまずですから最初はですね、やはりこの地球環境問題の研究には分野を超えたですね研究が必要ということで、まず分離融合の研究として進めようということで最初はスタートしました。特にある意味でですね、この分離融合での学際研究を柱にして、しかもその研究をですねプロジェクト方式で、これ大学共同利用機関ですから、大学のコミュニティ、大学の人たち、その日本の広い意味での研究者の人たちにこの地球環境研究、そういった地球環境研究の場を提供すると、そういう形でこの出発しました。で特に2004年に法人化、大学と国立大学と同時に法人化されました。でそれ以降ですね、6年ごとの中期計画、中期目標、中期計画というのがこの文科省の方で設定いたしまして、その6年ごとにそれぞれの機関は何をするかと。で私たちの研究所もですね、具体的な目標を設定しつつ研究を進めてまいりました。で第1期というのが2004年度から始まりましたが、まずその第1期6年間ではですね、地球環境に関わるさまざまな多岐にわたるテーマ、いろんなテーマがありますが、テーマをそのプロジェクト方式で、特に大きく5つの研究領域のプログラムに分けて進めてまいりました。で第2期はですね、もちろんこれは分離融合で進めてましたが、で第2期はですね、さらにこの分離融合からさらに進んでですね、私たちその当時設計科学的な視点、すなわちよりその解決に目指した形の方向の研究を進めようと。ということで、実は今日のご報告はですね、地球研未来設計イニシアティブとありますが、この未来設計イニシアティブというのをこの第2期に立ち上げて、ここで特にその設計科学的な視点、要するに社会と連携した形でですね、より解決を目指したような研究を進めるという方向を特に進めてまいりました。でそういう意味でですね、この設計科学的なアプローチというのは、いわば地球環境問題におけるですね、統合値といいますか、いろんな地というのがあります。もちろん大学とか研究所でやるような地と、それからもともといろんな社会でですね住んでいる場で長い歴史の中で培われた知識、こういったものもその環境を守るという意味で非常に重要なものがあります。そういうものを統合しながら進めていこう。でいわばその社会との連携でですね、問題解決に向けて、我々超学際研究という言い方しています。学際をさらに超えて、この超というのはこれは社会学際大学の学問のコミュニティを超えた形で社会と連携する形でやりましょうと。で日本語で一応その超学際研究という言い方をしていますが、その研究に向けて動き出しております。 で特にこの、ちょうど今3月ですが、この4月から第3期に入ります。この4月から開始される第3期の中期目標、中期計画では、これまでのその第1期、第2期の成果を生かしつつ、さらにですね、この統合的な地球環境学の構築の促進と、その特に大学共同利用機関としての機能をさらに強化する、そのための、いわば大きな計画、グランドデザインを、かなりこの1、2年かけて策定してまいりました。それに基づいて、4月から新しくさらに超学際研究という方向で研究を進めていこうと思っています。で詳しい話はこれからまた久保田副所長の方が今日のシンポジウムの趣旨含めましてお話しいたします。もう今日はドイツのですね、我々の先輩にあたる研究所になりますが、ポツダムにあります持続可能性高等研究所からChabay先生にも来ていただいて基調講演していただくと。でその後その地球研が何をこれまでやってきたか、これからどうするかというような話を夕方までご披露させていただきたいと思います。ちょっと長い時間ですが、ぜひ地球環境学の研究というのはどういうものか、それから地球研の活動はどういうものか、ぜひ楽しみながら聞いていただきたいと思います。どうかよろしくお願いいたします。
ありがとうございました。ただいま安成所長よりご紹介もありましたが、本日は大変お忙しい中、文部科学省研究振興局学術機関課牛尾紀文課長にご臨席いただいております。牛尾課長からご挨拶を頂戴したいと思います。よろしくお願いします。
皆さんおはようございます。ご紹介いただきました文部科学省で学術機関課長をしております牛尾でございます。総合地球環境学研究所未来設計イニシアティブ国際シンポジウム2016の開催にあたりまして一言ご挨拶申し上げたいと思います。まずは本日このように国内外から多数のご参加をいただきまして、人類喫緊の課題といえます地球環境問題の解決をテーマに国際シンポジウムが開催されますことを心からお祝い申し上げたいと思います。総合地球環境学研究所ですけれども、21世紀の最初の年である2001年の4月に設立されました最も新しい大学共同利用機関ということになります。これまで人文社会科学と自然科学分野の学際的連携によるプロジェクト方式によって人間と自然の相互作用という観点から地球環境問題の実態解明を行うとともに地球環境問題の解決に資するような国際共同研究を推進されてまいりました。その中でも特に新たな地球環境研究の国際的枠組みでございますフューチャーアースというものの推進にも大変大きな貢献をされてきております。大学共同利用機関といいますのは一つの大学ではできないようなですね大きな研究あるいは最先端の研究をいろんな大学を束ねてですね進めていくと、そういう機関でございまして、我が国の学術研究における中核的な機関でございます。共同利用共同研究活動を通じまして大学の研究機能の強化、それから新しい学問分野を創出すること、それから人材育成にも貢献するといったことが求められている機関でございます。今後各機関のミッションを再確認した上で一層機能強化を図るということが必要になっているところでございます。先ほどのご挨拶にもございましたけれども、4月から新しく第3期中期目標期間が始まりますけれども、ここにおきましては安成所長のリーダーシップの下で地球環境研究のアジアにおける中核拠点として研究機関や地域コミュニティとの国際ネットワークを基盤とした超学際的手法による新たな地球環境研究システムを創出し、多様な自然文化を有しているアジアにおける地球環境問題の解決と持続可能な社会の在り方の提言を目指すということが決められております。 文部科学省としても総合地球環境学研究所の今後の取り組みをしっかりとサポートしていきたいというふうに考えております。本シンポジウム、これから始まりますけれども、総合地球科学研究所が第3期中期目標期間において、具体的にどういう研究を進めようとされているのかということについて、広く社会の皆さんにご紹介させていただく絶好の機会でありますし、地球環境問題の解決について、国内外の参加者の皆さん方で、ぜひ活発な意見交換をしていただいて、今後の研究内容の進化というものを図っていただくということを期待しているところでございます。最後になりますけれども、本国際シンポジウムの開催にあたりまして、ご尽力いただいた関係の皆様に深く敬意と、あと感謝の意を表しますとともに、このシンポジウムが実り多いものとなることを記念いたしまして、私からの挨拶とさせていただきます。どうもありがとうございます。
ありがとうございました。では続きまして、地球研久保田純平副所長よりシンポジウムの趣旨説明をさせていただきます。
皆さんおはようございます。総合地球環境学研究所の、久保田と申します。今日のシンポジウムにつきまして、改めて、少しどういうことを私たちが、考えたのかというあたりを話させていただきたいと思います。で、まず最初に、これは私たちの研究所を空からちょっと撮ったものですけれども、京都の北の方、鞍馬の方に行く道があるんですけども、その近くにございます。で、すでに安成所長、それから、牛尾課長からご紹介ありました通り、2001年、地球環境問題の新しいアプローチを目指して、大学共同利用機関として創設されました。で、その時の所長でした日高俊孝先生、初代の所長ですけれども、地球環境問題の根源は自然に挑み支配しようとしてきた人間の生き方、言い換えればその文化の問題であるということをおっしゃられました。これが私たちの研究所の、最も基本的な、ベースとなる、考え方でございます。その地球環境変動そのものはある意味ではその自然の動きですけれども、やはりそれを引き起こしてきたものは人間であり、そこのところを考えていかないとなかなか解決には至らないという意味で、これをずっと私たちの、研究所の基本的な命題としております。それですでに、紹介ありました学際、超学際、ちょっと言葉が硬いんですけれども、さまざまな研究、問題の解決のためにはさまざまな分野が集まらなければいけない。でさらには後でちょっと説明いたしますけれども、地球研が考えているのはどういう未来にしていったらいいのかということでございます。ですからそのためには研究者が考えたらいいわけではない。人々皆さんがどういう未来にしていったらいいか、みんなと一緒に考えていかなくてはいけないわけです。でそれが結果的には、地球環境問題の解決につながるだろうという意味で、私たちはその、超学際あるいはトランスディスプリナリースタディとか言いますけれども、そういうことを念頭に置いて研究を進めています。それで、これがここ5、6年ですけれども、地球研の目指してきた枠組みです。安成所長の話にもありましたけれども、認識科学あるいは設計科学というような言い方をちょっとしておりますけれども、キーワードとして2つ、考えていただければと思います。で1つは人間と自然の相互作用感と言っております。で人類が生まれた時から当然私たちは自然との関わりの中でずっと生きてきます。でただしそれは一定のものではなくて常に変わり続けてきた。でそれが特に18世紀以降と申しましょうか、近年の人間活動の拡大の中でさまざまな問題を生じてきた。その人間と自然の関係性がどうあればいいのか、あるいは今どうなのか、どこが問題なのか、そこを私たちはまず明らかにしたいという意味で、人間自然相互作用感という言葉をよく使います。それからもう一つは未来可能性という言葉です。でこれは英語の方にはちょっと書いてあるんですけれども、持続可能性という言葉をよく使われる と思います。でこれもやはり初代の所長だった日高さんが言われたことなんですけれども、持続可能性というと今が良くてそれをなんとか将来に引き継ぎたいというふうな意味合いとして取られてしまいがちであるというか、彼自身がそう思ったんだろうと思いますけれども、ですからそういう現在を肯定して将来があるのではなくて、現在にさまざまな問題があって、でそれを変えていくことで未来があるのだという意味で、未来可能性という言葉を使っています。で英語では英語をどうしようかという時に随分みんなで議論したんですけれども、フューチャー、未来という言葉と、それから、可能性を示すポテンシャル、俺はアビリティを示すようなポシビリティなんですけれども、それを合わせたのでフューチャラビリティという新しい英語を作ったんですが、これは海外の方には必ずしもうまくなんていうかな、伝わらないということが起こりました。で今回のシンポジウムで考えたといいますか、第3期を考えていくときに、じゃあどういうふうな、意味合いで未来可能性というのを使ったらいいのかということを考えたときに、サステナブルフューチャーズ、そういう言葉がぴったりくるのかなということを私たちは今思い始めています。でこれは基調講演者であるイラン・チャバイさんもちょうどタイトルで使っておられたんですが、そういう意味でこれからこれを使っていけたらいいのかなというふうに思っています。で一つここで、注意していただきたいのは、実は資料ではですね、いろんな使い方をしてるんですが、サステナブルフューチャーズというふうに複数を使っています。でこれは未来というものはただ一つの未来が可能性としてそういうものがあるのではなくて、さまざまな地域の多様な世界中のさまざまな地域のさまざまな人々のそれぞれの未来があるはずです。だから私たちは決して最も望ましいと思われるような提言を一つしたいということではありません。それぞれの地域の人々とさまざまな人々とそれぞれの未来を考えたいわけです。それが私たちの目指すところです。でそういう意味では地球研というのは本当に地球環境問題を解決すると言いますけれども、その未来をどうしていくのかというのを考えようとしている研究所です。だからこそ未来を考えるとき、私たち研究者は私たちが考える未来を皆さんに押し付けたいと思っているわけではありません。皆さんと一緒に考えたい、皆さんと一緒に考えなくてはいけない。で単にどういう未来があり得るというのをそういう意味では提言するだけではなくて、一緒に行動しながらそれを考えていきたい。でそういう意味で、超学際研究というのを使わせていただいております。で改めて、今日のシンポジウム簡単に紹介しておきます。で長いタイトルを作りました。で意味するところは今申し上げた通りですけれども、やはり地球上いろんなやはり社会があり、人々があり、でそれぞれの歴史文化がある。でそういうのを踏まえた未来というのを私たちは考えていきたい。で、現在のままではやはり地球の将来っていうのはなかなか難しいものがある。だからそういう意味では未来可能な社会へ転換していく、それをどういうふうにしていったらいいのかというのを私たちは考えたいと思います。で、第2期ここ5、6年間、いろんなことをしてまいりました。でうまくいったのかうまくいってないのか、でそれは実際に転換が起きたのかどうかっていうのは5、6年ではなかなか難しいですから、そういう意味で最終的な結果が出てるわけではありません。私たちの取り組みを少し、どこまでできたのかというのを話させていただきたいと思っています。それからそれを踏まえて皆さんと一緒に、これからどうしていったらいいのかというのを話したいというふうに考えたいと思っています。で第1部では、基調講演者として、持続可能性高等研究所、これドイツにございます上席アドバイザーであるイラン・チャバイさんに、基調講演をいただきます。これはちょっとこなれない日本語で申し訳ないんですけれども、ステークホルダーのため、ステークホルダーと共にというのは一緒にという意味です。で持続可能な未来への道筋を考える。ここではサステナブルフューチャーというのを持続可能なというふうな意味や訳し方をしています。から第2部がこれ午後になりますけれども、私たちの第2期に行った研究の中から3つ ご紹介させていただきます。石川さんからエリアケーパビリティ、これもちょっと聞き慣れない言葉ですが、生物多様性の保全とそれから地域資源の活用というのを同時にどうやっていったらいいのかっていうのが話です。それから、アグネスさんというふうに私たちはよく呼んでるんですけれども、統合的水資源管理のための水道の治療ですね。これはその水をめぐるさまざまな争いというのはよく言われるわけですけれども、これをどういうふうに解決していったらいいのかというのをインドネシアでやった事例についてご報告します。それから最後に、地域環境地形性による新たなコモンズの創生と持続可能な管理ということで、佐藤哲さん、これは前の2つを受けたような形で、地球圏の今のこういうトランスディスプリナリー研究を総括していただくような話になると思っています。から3部ですけれども、まず、もう一人の副所長ですね、谷口さんの方から、第3期地球圏がどういうことをこれからしようとしているのかということを少し話させていただきます。その後で、パネルディスカッションを設けたいと思います。で、基調講演をいただいたイラン・チャバイ氏、それから NPO の笠木さんから共同通信社の井田さんから東京大学の安岡先生から、安成所長、この5名でパネルをやらさせていただきます。でやはりいろんな方とやはり地球圏の将来と、そして地球環境の研究の将来と、さらには地球そのものの将来とをこのパネルで、議論できればと思います。でコーディネーターは地球圏の佐藤哲教授が務めます。で以上が、今日のシンポジウムの予定でございます。ちょっと長い時間にわたりますけれども、ぜひ最後まで、お付き合いいただければと思います。どうかよろしくお願いいたします。
ありがとうございました。では基調講演に入らせていただきます。本日はドイツポツダムにあります持続可能性行動研究所よりイラン・チャバイ地球持続可能性学上席アドバイザーにステークホルダーのためステークホルダーとともに持続可能な未来への道筋を研究するという題でご講演いただきます。まずはご講演の前にちょっとの紹介をさせてください。持続可能性行動研究所、英語で言うと Institute for Advanced Sustainability Science IASS の上席アドバイザー、2012年より同研究所所属、IASS のスマートプロジェクト、スマートというと Smart Modes of Arctic Resource Driven Transformations の共同リーダー、知識、学習、社会変容研究連合、英語で言うと Knowledge, Learning and Social Change Alliance では2007年の発足以来議長を務める。社会科学、自然科学に関する50本を超える査読付き論文を発表している。スイス人文社会アカデミー名誉会員、アメリカ科学振興協会から科学教育における顕著な業績に関してアレン・B・レヴィントン・アワードを受賞。それではチャバイさんお願いします。
おはようございます。Thank you very much. I guess I don't need that. First of all, thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this very important and very interesting conference and discussion today. I have been looking forward to this, and not only because of the content itself, but because of the pleasure that I have had over many years now of working with my friends and colleagues at the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature. And I am deeply grateful for what I have learned with these colleagues, and there are many of them. And they have made this really a very special institution in my heart as a place to work and to think together. And it's that process of thinking together that I would like to expand on today. I would like to talk a little bit about ways that when we talk about doing research, there are many aspects of the way we do research. But under the current conditions, as Professor Yasunari and Professor Kubota have already mentioned and discussed, that there are new demands, new necessities because of the changing world that we live in, not only in terms of the physical conditions, but the social conditions. We only have to look around at the news any day that you turn on the news and see all the issues and difficulties that face us. So how do we do this in a way that actually addresses the root causes and allows us to get to a means of change? So I have entitled the talk, Researching Pathways to Sustainable Futures with and for Stakeholders. So the point is not only that we are doing the research, we are doing it with the stakeholders. And by stakeholders, that means all of the society that is particularly involved in a particular situation. Maybe it's just a small community. Maybe it's the world as a whole through the UN or other agencies. Maybe it's a country. Maybe it's Japan. But it is the people who both make changes and make effects, and the people who are affected by that, who are hurt or helped or enjoy the benefits of that. So the question is not only how do we do this research, and in this very important statements that were made already this morning about designing the sustainable futures, we also have to think that it's not only about the information, the new knowledge that research provides, which is the function of research, after all, is to create new knowledge, produce new knowledge, but to help people make meaning of that knowledge, to learn. The situation is changing rapidly in the world. We can't go back and look at a textbook and say, oh, yes, we have this problem, we should use that way to solve it. We don't have that textbook. We are building it, we're writing it, we are learning it every day, all of us. And we must learn how to do that better, how to do the learning. So the making meaning is the learning, because from that comes effective and informed decision making. So that's really the direction I'm trying to go. So I want to talk a little bit about both the core missions, which are very similar and very important. And it is interesting that not only is the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature about to enter its third phase, as you just heard, but second, the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies is about to enter its second phase. So we're one phase behind you, but we're trying to catch up. We have two new directors. We have 3 scientific directors and 1 administrative director. This is a new structure to some degree, and it opens and offers interesting opportunities, not only for our institute, but I hope for the collaboration with RIN as well. What kind of science do we need for these sustainable futures? As Professor Kubota just spoke about, that I like the term sustainable futures in plural because it is dependent on the context. So it isn't one future that we're supposed to go to. We don't even know what it is. We don't know what sustainability is in the broadest sense. We are learning our way toward it. So futures is helpful. But we also have to think about what are the distinctions between output of our work and the outcome of our work. Science is in itself a social contract. It is not an absolute thing. It is something we've agreed that humanity has designed as a way of looking at the world around us and coming to some useful conclusions. That gets me to really where I think the heart of the matter is the process of mutual learning excuse me, across disciplines and with the stakeholders. And then talking about collaboration, talking about collective behavior in the classica, what I call, sorry. All right, better. The Knowledge, Learning, and Societal Change Alliance, which I now call Classica, and how do we get to actually making changes in society? And that's the focus of that. So that then leads me, at last, I will talk a little bit about changes in research and in education. So in the mission statement of RIN, in a sort of, I guess, is still an intermediate statement, so this is not meant to be descriptive of RIN, but it's what I found as the last version that I saw. But I think you heard already much of the idea, and transdisciplinarity and stakeholder solution-based research were key ideas. And it is stated in here in the idea of finding solutions to environmental problems, and that looking at the interactions of humanity and nature to get to future potential, the sustainable futures for human culture. Let me contrast that or combine it with that of the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies, which is focused very specifically on transformative knowledge, knowledge which allows us to make changes in society, not just to understand them, but to make them, we need to understand them, and we need to understand them with the knowledge and the participation of the stakeholders. Thus, it is also, as with RIN, transdisciplinary. And it's about developing solutions, same idea. What maybe is a little different aspect, different from most programs, and I think is an important thing that we might think about together, is the idea of how do we support decision-making by making meaning, by understanding the research we do, so that society is able to make informed and effective decisions. Whether that's a decision by the local Reindeer Herders Association or the Fishermen's Cooperative or the national ministries or the UN or whatever regional organization or non-governmental organization. There are lots of these decisions, but on what basis are they made? And how do we contribute to that? We aren't the ones that need to make those decisions, if you will, the researchers. It is the ministries, it is the local mayor, it is the group in the community of fishermen, whatever it is. They need to make decisions, but they need decisions where they have good scientific information that they understand and that they participate in developing, so they own it. It isn't just something, here you are, go do it. It's something they care about. How do we do that? That's where we will get to. So, fulfilling our missions, the question is, of course, we produce stuff, lots of it. Unfortunately, lots of it sits on shelves all over the world and does nothing very much. We all feel good about it. Okay, I've published, 99 million papers on whatever. So what? What does that do? Well, it certainly is important that we use appropriate methods for high-quality data, and we use careful analysis. We collect data, and we collect it carefully, and we have to think about the quality of that. Where does it come from? How do we know it is valid data? But we also have to think about the conceptual frame. What were we thinking about? What was our concept, our hypothesis, if you will, in formal terms, in collecting the data? What are we looking for? And maybe very critical and often forgotten is a question of interpretation. So data doesn't tell you the answer. I'll give you an interesting example. Maybe many of you have played musical instruments. My father was a musician, so I grew up with this, sang with the Metropolitan Opera and all over the world. In fact, here in Tokyo, when I was 15, my father had a concert with the NHK Symphony, which was great fun, and spent several weeks here. But think about this. Here's 5 lines on a piece of paper, and there's some dots on the lines or between the lines. You can take the violin and play every note. That's the data. That's not music, unless you interpret it, unless you make sense of it in your terms. And what makes it great art, great performance, is that interpretation. And that's what makes good science, is what kind of a good interpretation can we come up with that can be tested, attempted to be falsified, keep trying to break it. If it doesn't break after lots of testing by different people under different conditions, you begin to say, it's pretty good. We can use that. Until maybe somebody comes up with another piece that says it's not quite the whole story. So we publish in widely accessed professional journals, books, reports, but we can also use social media now, which allows for both visibility, engagement of people in a different way, and scalability in an important way. I don't have time to go into that further now, but I think it's important. And obviously there are events. Whoa, that was interesting. Let's try this again. Sorry. Okay, so the one thing I want to mention here is that it's not only our scientific journals, but art forms, music, dance, paintings, sculpture, are ways of also expressing the interpretation of the science that we do, and can be done in some very important ways. Social outcomes. Okay, so what happens to the stuff that we produce? What are the outcomes? What are the impacts and the effects? So one thing, it might bring new people into the discussion. It might bring new actors. It might engage people who have not been engaged, but it's also a way of making our work transparent so people understand what it is we do and how it affects them. It changes perceptions and expectations of what is science and what is this interface between science and society. It's almost like we've gotten used to sort of seeing science over here and society over there, but I'm sorry, we're all part of society. The science isn't separate from the society and never was. Policy is an important thing that often comes up, and what I want to stress is that by policy, I don't mean only at the UN or at the Diet or the US Congress or whatever. It's at all levels that we have to be able to act, because that's the only way we get the whole range of society to move towards the futures that they want. And practice, developing new norms, new ways of thinking about ourselves in that, what we consider normal ways of practice, and also the capacity to act in new ways, and with that, the sense of agency. By agency, I mean the sense I am capable of doing something. It's not just that somebody else will do it, but that I'm capable of acting in some important way in this regard. So how do we do science? One can talk about disciplinary science, the classic view of science, which is very much out of the Enlightenment, out of the 18th century and beyond. And it's very much what we call reductionist, which is a very important thing. It's about narrowing the focus so that you can isolate what's happening and test it. So it's based on creating questions, hypotheses, guesses, testing them, and repeating that until something begins to emerge that makes sense and that you can't break. You keep trying to find what's wrong with it, and if you don't, you begin to believe maybe this is useful. But it's a narrow focus, and it can be both fundamental research and applied research, but it's driven by either problem solving, as in engineering, or by fundamental curiosity. There's also the whole area of interdisciplinary research, which focuses on multiple interacting components of a complex system. And that's a key point, that a complex system is not one cannot really understand it by looking only at each piece, as in the common view of reductionist science. If you look at only one part of a complex system, you may miss entirely the coupling, which may be delayed, may be spatially different, that makes this whole system function in the way that it does. So it relies on going back to systems thinking, as was developed in many important ways by the Meadows and many others. But it's also combining a depth of knowledge, not superficial, but combining the depth of knowledge from multiple disciplines, and establishing a shared language. And I can assure you, and I'm sure many of you know, that is a really tough problem. And I don't mean between Japanese and English. That's a big enough problem as just the discussion about sustainable futures is, just finding the right words. But even with a group of colleagues, all of whom speak English as native speakers, trying to find common language between the psychologist, the political scientist, the chemist, the economist, the lawyer. In the group that I'll tell you about later that working on the Arctic, I have all of those in that group. And we work hard at trying to understand each other. And it is really a difficult but essential process. I think it's also not only essential in terms of the research, but I think it's essential in our understanding our own process, in being reflexive about the way we go about research. We use different methods, we use different theories, and different concepts. And even the way we talk about theory. I was originally, I did laser physics and chemistry. I was spent many years at National Institutes of Standards and Technology in Washington, and then as professor at Stanford in natural science. And the first time, then I became also professor of sociology at University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And I remember going to the first lecture or seminar that while I was there, and the speaker talked about a theory. And I very stupidly raised my hand. I said, well, yeah, but how do you test your theory? What's the empirical basis for this? They just looked at me like, no, we don't do that. I said, really? Then why is it a theory? And eventually I came to understand this whole idea of schools of thought in social science, et cetera. But there's a whole set of differences in the way we think about this. Obviously also issues of both including quantitative and qualitative approaches. And in much of classical science, quantitative approaches are privileged over qualitative. And that is not useful in some cases that we need to look at. So that leads us to transdisciplinary research and the process of mutual learning with humility, with trust, and both disciplinary depth and interdisciplinary breadth. And the words humility and trust, I think, are really important. So you can't have this mutual learning, this dialogue of not just, here, I'll tell you what I think, you tell me what you think, and then we go home. That doesn't work. We really need to learn from each other, with each other. We need to provoke our learning with each other. But that takes understanding that each of us doesn't have the answer. None of us do. There is so much, and the issues are so complex. We need all of us thinking together to make sense of this. So humility is important, and trust is important. And it's research driven by the needs, and I would also add the visions of the stakeholders, of their futures, in their context. So when I'm working with a group of Inuit fishermen in Nuuk, Greenland, let's say, it's a very different story than, for example, Professor Sato working in Malawi with fishermen. It's a very different context, a different politics, a different conditions. Many things are different. So we have to take that into account, and not simply the way we from the outside might view the situation. And it's conducted with and for stakeholders by engaging them, if possible, from the very beginning through the entire project. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So we need what is both necessary, the disciplines, and sufficient, the engagement, in order to do the science that we need for the future. And I would also say that we have to understand that science is a social contract. We agree. Science is about getting these ideas, getting data, interpreting it, and testing it among us. It is a social contract in that sense. And that means it is inescapably normative. And what I mean by that is that we cannot get away from the fact that when we look at this, we have a bias. We are not objective, none of us. We never were, science never was. Because it can be a question of who funds the science, for what reason, who gets to do it, who is it for, who benefits, who doesn't. So these are always normative. They're always about the values that are implicit, embedded in the way we do the work. And it is really important when we're thinking about humanity and culture that we keep that in mind and don't sort of push it aside and say, oh, we're being very objective. We can try to be as open and transparent as we can be. That's not the same as being completely objective. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's the reality. And that means that this is ethically subjective research. And it inevitably raises questions of ethics. And we should be addressing those in our work. We can't leave it aside for the philosophers and the ethicists to argue about over on the side, because we'll ignore them anyway. In the Arctic project, for example, I have a wonderful philosopher, ethicist, and also a theologian who are involved in the research. And they are tremendously helpful, as well as a historian, by the way. So let me go now to talk a little bit about the Arctic and the Arctic research project that we're doing. I want to do this not to specifically talk about the Arctic per se. That is interesting to some, maybe not, but I'm really trying to use it as an example of an approach to research that I've already talked about some parts of this, but I'd like to illustrate it with some of this. But I couldn't help putting some photos up there. And one of the fun things was when I came to Japan, I flew from Washington to Haneda. I can't remember what day it was. I guess it was Monday. But as it turned out, this was from, there we go. This was from Whitehorse, Yukon Territory a year ago. as is this. That was one of the old paddle wheel steamers that took the miners into the Klondike Gold Rush area. I've spent a lot of time backpacking for 4 or 5 weeks in complete wilderness in these areas. But on Monday, I flew from Washington to Haneda and flew between Fairbanks and Point Barrow, which is right there on the Arctic Ocean. And as it turns out, next week I will be in Barrow, and then in Fort Yukon here, and then in Fairbanks at the Arctic Council Sustainable Development Working Group meeting that I've been invited to as both from the U.S. State Department, because I'm a U.S. citizen, but also as an expert for the German ministry, foreign ministry, representing them. This photo I took out the window. It's not a very good photo, but as it turns out, that was taken right where that aircraft was there. And so Barrow is somewhere up here, Fort Yukon, where I will visit and spend a day in the Gwich'in-Ja Tribal Council meeting, is somewhere there, and Fairbanks is the other way. Anyway, that was sort of fun to get to see that while I'm on my way over here. It's cool. So the project is called, I started this about 2.5 years ago, and it's called Sustainable Modes of Arctic Resource-Driven Transformations, or we call it SMART, which makes us the smarties. Yeah. And it's co-led by Dr. Katrine Kyle, who is really an Arctic expert and a wonderful researcher, and myself. She's a political scientist. The point is that there are rapid and profound changes happening in the Arctic, faster because of climate change than anywhere else in the world. And these effects are seen in the complex regional and global changes as well, but also in the societal interactions. So the way I think of it and the way I started this project was realizing that, yes, climate change is causing a big change in the Arctic, and it's enabling the transformations at a social level that are really going to be the critical pieces. But the demand for resources that the Arctic ice retreat and other things are opening up is not coming from the Arctic. It's coming from the rest of the world, Japan included. So what is it that we can do to make that transformation more sustainable and not damage the environment further and allow for the livelihoods of the people who live there, not just the indigenous community. The indigenous community is only about 10–15% of the total transglobal or circumpolar population. But there are many other people there, and they have to have a way to live too. So it's a tension, as in many places in the world, between development and the environment, to put it simply. We're focusing on Norway, Russia, and Greenland because the US and Canada, in a sense, don't have a strong motive to develop the Arctic resources to the same degree because they, for better and worse, thanks to fracking and oil shale and oil tar sands, are able to extract oil and gas from non-Arctic regions, or at least on land Arctic areas. So the goals of the project are to improve the pathways towards sustainable futures in the Arctic, to create informed and effective governance at multiple levels. And I mentioned this earlier, but let me say a little more by what I mean by effective. If people are engaged, if the process is transparent, and people are engaged in understanding the process of research that's going on, not as scientists, but if you talk to people who are fishing, they know a lot about where the fish are, how they behave, when they're where, what kind of conditions lead to population growth of the fishing or collapse. And we need to use that knowledge as well, but also to engage them, because then they believe, and rightly so, that they have an investment in the work and therefore in the outcomes. I mentioned before outcomes and output. So the outcome now is, do we change behaviors or don't we? Not just whether we write a report or whether we recommend that they do such and such, but what do they actually do? What changes or doesn't? And if that's going to happen, they have to be part of this process throughout, and I'll come back to that in detail. So we want to understand the local and the global drivers of change in the Arctic. Let me just point out that Japan, China, Singapore, India, Korea, Italy are recent observer states of the Arctic Council. Now, none of those states is in the Arctic, but they are now formally considered observer states, which is to say they have expressed their deep interest in the development of the Arctic, and the Arctic Council has recognized that. And so there's a great deal of reason to understand not only what happens in the Arctic, but the fact that it doesn't stay in the Arctic. It affects the rest of the globe and vice versa. That's true of air pollution effects. That's true of water pollution, marine pollution. It's true of the demand for resources. It's true of demographic shifts. There are a whole set of reasons that these are coupled now, not independent areas. So we want to look at the impact of changes on air pollution sources and transport of pollutants, on laws and regulation, on the economics of resource demand. You know, one thing one can sort of breathe a little bit easier saying, oh, well, the oil price has gone down, so maybe there won't be so much demand to go into the Arctic to get oil and gas. Well, yes, in principle, but then there's the fact that basically Russia and Norway are dependent on the oil. So there's a complex situation here. It's obviously a matter of politics, of demographics, and certainly of cultures. So that leads again to the transdisciplinary design and use of scenarios, of composite, what I call composite scenarios for decision making, and I'll explain that in a moment. We want not only to do that, but we want to evaluate our own process so that we learn from this process overall, and to improve the whole nature and understand better how do we do transdisciplinary research. Sounds fine, just go out and get the stakeholders. Yeah, well, it doesn't quite work that way or that easily. So we'll come back to that in a minute, but that is a goal here. Let me briefly mention that there are two categories here. There are rights holders and stakeholders. Very often I just refer to stakeholders, but for many communities that are indigenous, they prefer to be referred to as rights holders because in at least some cases, unfortunately not in all, they have been given legal right to the resources, to the land on which they for centuries, millennia have lived. And so they prefer to be seen as rights holders, just so you understand that what I'm referring to. So we have had meetings for the Arctic Project with stakeholders and rights holders in Potsdam and Moscow and St. Petersburg and Reykjavik and Ottawa. In fact, last year here in Toyama in Japan at the Arctic Science Summit Week, actually in a number of other places, and we're about to have several more in Arkhangelsk and Nenets, in Naryan Mar in the Nenets province. I will be, as I mentioned, next week at the Sustainable Development Working Group meeting in Barrow, Alaska, and then at a Gwich'in Tribal Council meeting in Fort Yukon. We're working through the Sustainable Development Working Group of the Arctic Council, both through the U.S. Department of State and the German Foreign Ministry. And we are in dialogue with many of the observer states. So we've been collaborating with experts in oceanography and in political development in India, in China, and would love to do so also with those interested in the Arctic development in Japan. And I've been involved, I was invited to be part of a planning group on a big Arctic Futures initiative that IASA, the International Institute for Applied System Analysis in Vienna, organized last fall, and which will launch in 2017 with the support largely of the Finnish government. And that also will complement the kind of work we're doing. That's maybe worth a note. That is an integrated assessment analysis approach. Fantastic, and they are, absolutely world-class at doing that. What it will be very interesting is to couple that to the scale, the downscaled work that we're doing at multiple decision-making levels. And we've decided to put some of that together. In the images, I think the upper one there, was in Iceland, and there are some members from the Aleut Tribal Council here. This was in Whitehorse, Yukon, the year before, with a number of different groups present. We are collaborating with the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany. It's the premier polar and marine research institute, and are developing a much broader sort of repertoire of approaches to this that take advantage of their deep knowledge of the science and the capacity. They have the polar stern icebreaker that's drifting in the north now, and looking at these various aspects. And the Jade Hochschule is a marine university and has expertise in shipping and marine science, and they're collaborating with us as well. So let me take a moment then to talk a little bit about the stakeholder, the transdisciplinary aspect of what we're trying to do. The point is, and this I stress this because very often when I talk with colleagues who are particularly natural science, but also some social science, they sort of say, what do you mean transdisciplinary? How are you going to co-design it? They don't know the science. How are they going to tell me what science I should do, how I should do my research? I don't want them coming in telling me how to do my research. Well, that's not actually the idea. The idea is that among the science community who's involved, you sort of say, these are the things we know how to do. We know something about this area. I'm not going to go in and do a project on cancer development in North Africa. I don't have the competence. I wouldn't even, that's not a question I would pose to the stakeholders there. Others might. So what's the basic starting point is what we have up here in defining of visions and sort of key principles that the group of scientists or researchers feel that they have the broad competence to address. That then goes to research, to defining a domain that's shaped by those core competences. Where can we be helpful and competent to answer questions? Then the second piece is to map, to identify and map and the contact with stakeholders. And I want to be careful. When I use the word map, it's not a very good word really, because I don't mean a geographic map of where are the stakeholders. I mean characterizing the stakeholder, understanding the power relationships between them, understanding who has resources and who does not, who has expertise and can participate, or who feels that they can't because they don't know enough about a particular topic. Those things have to be taken into account very carefully. Otherwise, you cannot have this humility, trust, and a mutual learning environment. And that takes a lot to establish. I opened the Polish Fisheries Roundtable, 7 years ago, and it's running on its own now and so forth. But it took us 9 months of ethnography, if you will, of careful interviewing, observing, etc., to figure out how we could structure this roundtable. Now it's running and everybody's involved and everybody feels they are learning from it, so they keep showing up after years. At first it was very difficult to drag them in, by the collar, come in and join. They didn't want to. And the discussion went, the person who yelled loudest, longest won the argument. That was it. That wasn't exactly an analytic discourse or very useful. So one needs to understand the stakeholders, not just to identify them. Then once that's there, it's a process of connecting with them. You can't talk to all the stakeholders. So you pick key people and you hope that it snowballs. And you think about how do those people you picked, do they represent the rest of the stakeholder community? Do they communicate with the rest of the stakeholder community? If I pick somebody from the Fishermen's Union, does anybody else among the fishermen find out? Or does it all just with this one man or woman who kind of shows up at meetings and goes home? So there are a whole set of issues around that make this not a simple process, but a critical one. Then the process of actually engaging them. And I've diagrammed this in a particular way to emphasize the idea that stakeholders may be engaged at many different points. Doesn't mean that every stakeholder is part of every part of the process. No, but they are free to be part of it and encouraged to be. So there's a process of framing and prioritizing the research questions, of designing the research, what is often referred to as co-design. So, okay, that's there. But they may be involved in data collection in some cases, very crucially. They may be the best people to collect some of the data. In our case, in the Arctic, getting emissions inventories from some areas is very difficult. We will need the stakeholders to be, and the rights holders to be able to do that. The data analysis, there may be people among them that are very good at that, there may not, either way. But absolutely crucially, interpretation of the data. So again, going back to the playing the violin or whatever, there's the data we've collected. We've analyzed it, so we've in a sense categorized it and tried to organize it in some way. Now, what does it mean? What's important to the stakeholders in this? What's important to us in it? And then from that to develop and communicate a set of essentially scenarios for decision making, and I'll come to that in one moment. And out of that, then a dialogue and a communication process with the broader community, leading to a real support for decision making by stakeholders, but also policy briefs, academic papers, et cetera, et cetera. It's not that those don't happen, but that to me is not the primary output, because that's not what leads to the primary outcome. What do I mean by these scenarios? I don't think in many of these cases we are capable of creating a scenario of the world. We have very limited knowledge. We have limited pieces. So what I think of it is as essentially a composite of different models that create scenarios and that we put together in some way, emphasizing one or another of these depending on what the stakeholder needs. So is this a decision about developing a new port in the middle of the Arctic? And what do they need? Are they most concerned about the sea ice and future weather? Or are they more worried about economic and political factors? Or how do they balance that? And out of that comes a matrix of outcome, of consequences, excuse me. So the consequences come from that. So the point is we offer the options for decisions, and with each of those, our best estimate from the science of what the consequence would be. But we don't make the decision. We're not designing the outcome. They are. They use it, and it happens at different levels. I'm going to skip the next slide just very briefly as more detail on the way that one uses that. But I want to go now to a broader set here very quickly in the last couple of minutes here about Classica, the Knowledge, Learning, and Societal Change Alliance. And I called it Classica just to be easier than KLSC. But the mission is to understand, enable, and importantly, to encourage processes of collective behavior change towards just and equitable sustainable futures. That is not just about the sustainable futures, but doing that in a way that is just, is fair, and gives people a better chance across very different conditions for this. And it's, again, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. And to understand this interplay, we often talk about the knowledge to action gap. And my view is, boy, there's a heck of a lot in that gap because it has to do with the way we learn and we make meaning. It's not just the knowledge alone doesn't lead to actions. We have lots of examples of that. But that's the important thing. And to use that understanding to have real impact on policy and practice in the terms of the sustainable futures. I won't go through these. These are a little bit of the history. Something I started in 2007 was approved by the International Human Dimensions Program in 2011 after a wonderful workshop in Grindelwald, Switzerland. And there, again, there was a whole range of people, including Professor Sato. And the whole idea was to have this mixture of disciplines, from neuroscience to choreographer, dancer, to natural science, to a hydraulics engineer, philosopher, etc., to begin to see how do we think about not just behavior, but on collective behavior, which is what we need to get to a sustainable future. So I'm going to skip this. The main point is that there are a number of things that came out of the workshop that we just had in February at IASS. But most importantly in that, I think this is important to say, that a quote from Oren Young, wonderful colleague, it's not enough to adopt policies or negotiate agreements, for example, the Paris Agreement, and hope for the best. What we need is the collective behavior change or shifts in actual practices. So the question then becomes a matter of directing attention to identifying the conditions that can generate or produce collective behavior change in response to situations of the sort that we now confront. And we have a portfolio, we have a core group, we have a major journal article that I'm working on, though I'm behind. Case study symposia is what we're launching. We will have the first one in Taiwan in November 2016 on collective behavior change for sustainable futures in island and isolated communities. We will have other themes in the subsequent symposia. And I would say we are at the beginning of an adventure together into new conditions, new knowledge, new science, and new ways of learning for the future. And I welcome the opportunity to join with you as colleagues and institutions in developing that adventure for the future of humanity. So thank you very much for your attention and your thought.
イランさんありがとうございました。質疑応答の時間少し10分ぐらいありますので、ご質問がある方手を挙げてください。この方に。
Thank you very much for your
It's on.
Thank you very much for your very comprehensive talk. I'm very enjoyed your talk. I enjoyed your talk very much. My question is on your slide titled "Engaging with Stakeholders" on the Arctic research.
Okay. See if I can get it quickly for you.
Okay, thank you.
This one.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, my question is on the relation between the top two boxes and the boxes below. According to this chart, stakeholders' involvement is from the second line. On the first line, you show the definition of vision and key principles of project, and shaping core competencies and the research area of researchers. Well, these two boxes would define the whole structure. For me, I think that these two boxes define the whole structures. And since then, if you would do the stakeholder involvement, what would be the relation between the stakeholders' opinion on the whole scheme of the project?
That's a very good and important question. And I apologize because I think the diagram is not as clear as it should be. I'll keep working on it. The point is that maybe if I go to the second one, the point is that we have, as a research community, particularly for whatever project you want, we have a set of things that we actually are able to do research on. I mean, that we have competence to do. The question is, which of these are generally, or maybe we've left something out, and the stakeholders will tell us that. But that what we can't do is, in a sense, go in and say, what do you want us to do? It just doesn't work. So there is a recognition that there is some initial larger box that we work within. And part of it is to have a sense of that box as openly as possible. And then, given that, you can begin to, and my experience has been that you actually have to provoke some of those questions. Because very often the stakeholders who have not been involved, I mean, there are some who have a lot of scientific background and no problem, but many who don't. And they feel overwhelmed or intimidated by it. So then one has to sort of start by promoting some questions and starting a dialogue, which comes also with the need to have this mapping, to understand who it is you're talking to, and then to help them get engaged. I understand the ambiguity in that. And I think you're very perceptive in picking that up. It's very important. But I think we have to find some way in between there.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
他にそっちと。
フューチャース事務局の春日と申します。Thank you very much for a very holistic, wonderful speech with good examples. I enjoyed a lot. And my question is that related to Future Earth. As you know, Future Earth is the global research platform to address global issues via inter- and transdisciplinary approach. As you just described and with your approaches. And could I have your vision to collaborate with Future Earth with your background and with your ongoing projects?
Thank you very much for the question. I somewhat deliberately left out a discussion of Future Earth because I didn't want to, it was a matter of timing, but this is a wonderful opening. Thank you. I'm certainly very much influenced by the thinking of Future Earth, and as you may know, I've been involved with both on the scientific committee for IHDP, which was the sort of one of the four predecessors to Future Earth, and with the early visioning process of ICSU, and then with Heide Hagman and the Social Science Council and UNU since, whatever it was, 2008, 2009. So to me, I have learned a great deal from the evolution of Future Earth. And I hope very much that this kind of what I was trying to outline today, I hope and believe is very much in line with the thinking of Future Earth. And look forward also to both with IASS, but also with Classica specifically, to join in the knowledge action networks and other mechanisms of promoting this kind of solution-focused and transdisciplinary research. I'll add one other piece to it that I would maybe even push the boundaries a little bit if I may be allowed, which is that I worried that it not be misinterpreted in terms of solution-oriented into much of an engineering approach, and that the visions and the artistic and philosophical and spiritual aspects are tremendously important in inspiring people to move towards a sustainable future in their terms, in their conditions. And I think we could strengthen the language and the thoughts about that as we go.
Thank you very much. We're looking forward to learning from your experiences.
Well, and vice versa.
Mutual.
Just one final question.
Thank you, Ilan. I'm Ted Sado from this institute. I think this transdisciplinary processes is core of both Future Earth and various type of research actions currently happening all over the world for solutions of global environmental issues. And as Professor Yasuoka's question clearly stated, probably something missing from this diagram. This is probably focusing on code design part of the transdisciplinary process is a mutual learning component, I think. There is probably Professor Yasuoka's concern may be related to the fixed structure of scientific framing that stays on the top. Mm-hmm. These entire process has a kind of feedback loop to almost the entire part of over the top, so that we can sometimes learn from the stakeholders to change our mindset, or even inviting another scientist to cover whatever needed by the community. So probably mutual learning component should be in this diagram, so that the design itself evolves quite rapidly.
Yeah, there is this iterative loop there, but I think what you're saying, both of you were saying, in a sense, that's in the wrong place. And so I should fix that. I think I can do that. Thank you.
Or even multiple
exactly.
iterative lines, yeah.
No, I completely agree. It's a work in progress. I'm trying to learn too, So. Okay.
Okay. Let's all thank Chabay-san.
My pleasure.
それではここから約1時間お昼の休憩とさせていただきます。休憩の際は貴重品と通訳の機器をお持ちになって会場を後にしてください。 再開は午後1時になります。1時にお待ちしておりますので、ぜひ時間までにお戻りください。